So hi, I have some slides, as I guess you haven't. Let me see technology here. So while I'm starting, let me ask a quick question. I know sometimes I often talk to folks, and when I start talking about databases, the eyes glaze over. How many people here are familiar with databases? Or excellent. That's how I know, like the people next to me too. Great. Okay. So a lot of what I'm going to cover here is probably not a surprise. And as Candace just introduced, a lot of the privacy concerns we're seeing today comes from how do people control the information not only they have, but that others have about them. And to add a third layer to that, you know, often we think about what information is out there that the store is gathering about me, what information is out there that a camera is gathering. Often I like to add, you know, let's think about the information that is held by the government. And what I wanted to do is cover a couple of the projects that we're facing here in Washington State, or up in Washington State rather. And so I wanted to start with this quote from Bruce Schneier, who is a security expert, who does all kinds of consulting work, and I highly recommend his blog to those of you who read blogs. But you know, as you see here, he covers how data can control our lives, and whoever is in control of that data about one person has a lot of power. So if you start with that framework and add to that, that technology has really changed how people can collect, how easy it is to collect information, and how easily it is to share that information and to reuse it for other purposes. That kind of puts us in this really awkward situation where privacy isn't dead, but it's a very vicarious situation right now where we have to be ever vigilant, looking at, you know, each program that pops up to say, okay, how do we protect our privacy with this? Starting with government, and just to kind of highlight a couple different government systems, Andre had mentioned Real ID, and as a pizza video, you know, it came up and said, we noticed that your national ID number is XYZ, da 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 da. That's something that with Real ID, you would have that standardization. So this is not, again, too far into the future. Other identity situations that we're looking at, or things that we've been working on in Washington, are new technologies being introduced into identity systems. So a lot of folks here probably know that we have RFID in new passports. Passports have been issued since 2006. And you know, there's personal information in there. And many folks a couple of years ago had to lobby for how do you protect the information that's going into that passport. And this is still a concern because it's not only that information about you is held now in a computer chip in your passport, but you have to consider how does that information travel out? How do people access it? It's no longer that somebody could come to you and say, hey, I want to see your ID. Is there a possibility that somebody could read your identity information from afar without you noticing? The enhanced driver's license is something that we've been working on up in Washington State because it also has an RFID chip in it. And although it doesn't have personal information on the chip, what it does have is a unique identification number. And this is actually using the same type of RFID as they use for shipment of boxes like UPS. So I now have, you know, if I have an enhanced driver's license, I get my very own personal tracking number. And so when it can be read from 20 feet away. So again, you know, linking about what's that information, now you could gather information about how I travel, or you could see me go by at a given point, all from 20 feet away without me knowing. Other records, let me see, as I'm trying to see what I'm popping up when. Okay, so transportation, as we'd mentioned earlier, another thing that is kind of perhaps not something that first comes to mind is new systems that come up in the government sector for efficiency. How can we make transportation payments more efficient? And again, you know, from the programmatic standpoint, there's all kinds of good reasons to do this. You want to have people be able to drive through the freeways fairly quickly without having to stop and like throw the change in the little change collector and wait in line while you're going through and paying. Same thing on the buses. Is there a way that we could facilitate bus payments? So as you build systems to address those issues, and in Washington we're facing two such systems, one to pay tolls and another for buses, ferries, trains, a consolidated system, you have to look at, well, what information does this then provide? So up in Washington, we have information being gathered now, or systems in creation rather, where for the toll payment for an individual car, and it's linked to the car, and you know the identity behind that car can also be provided. You can have information about where that car paid tolls at a certain point in time. This is something that's been happening on the East Coast for some time, and those records have been found to be very useful in things like divorce cases and custody cases. You know, you said you're home all the time. Well, we see you've been driving north up a couple states every weekend. What's going on? So it's a collection of data that people might not realize is going on when they're paying their toll. Same thing with the bus systems. We actually have a program that's in the works and ready to launch next year that we've been following quite closely because it's taking bus payments, bus, trains, and so on for 4 different counties. And all that information would be provided to whoever subsidizes your bus pass. And up where we are, that often is employers, social services. And so now all of a sudden what that would mean is that an employer might be able to see where I've used my bus pass on the evenings, on the weekends, down to the route ID, like the bus number, time, date, and so on. So while it's not a precise, latitude, longitude of where I've been, it's pretty darn close. And you can guess where somebody's gone through that. Makes the process of finding one's location and what their day-to-day activities are a lot easier. Now, those aren't the only pieces of information that's out there. As you guys have heard a lot through various action alerts, I'm sure. We have video surveillance, which had come up, in which case, it's not only what data is being collected, but who's on the other side of that camera? Who's watching? Is it being recorded? If so, for how long? We're looking at this in city parks up in Seattle right now. Commercial records, and I'm really happy to see Lee here because he can talk about the NSA spying, but we've all heard a lot about, how cell phone networks and, cell technology and conversations behind it, how that can be shared out and how information about who we call and when we call them all of a sudden becomes vulnerable. Public records I put up here just to point out that this is an area that often we don't think about because as the ACLU, we want to make sure that this information is transparent. We want to make sure we have public oversight. But at the same time, a lot of very personal information is in public records. Think of your mother's maiden name, your birth date. Think of how much is out there. Voter registration records, DOL records. So at some point, there needs to be that distinction of what is the information that's held by the government about a person, and what is information that is about government operations. And how do we separate that out so that we can still have oversight and protect privacy? And that's a very tricky thing to do, but it's something that by being ever vigilant and raising these issues as they come up, we can work on. So just to leave you guys, I think my time's quickly coming to an end here. I wanted to outline a framework just to help everyone think about these issues. This is kind of, a quick hit list, and I realized I spelled out the acronym CRUD yesterday, which was kind of amusing. Working at the federal level, you love acronyms. But what I wanted to point out was, when you start with a system, it's helpful, any system. Let's take video surveillance, for example. A couple things you want to ask. First of all, what is the collection? What's being collected? Who's collecting it? For example. Retention. How long is that information held? The videotapes. Is it videotape going to be recorded and held for 10 years, 100 years, 5 minutes? How long is that going to exist? Who has access to it when it is there? And this goes to, if you think of DOL records and the threat for identity theft, you want to think about how do they secure it and make sure that only people have access at a certain time. Use, the U in my CRUD, use comes down to how is that being used? Is it used for the purpose it was originally collected for? So voter registration records, are they used for voter registration? Are they repurposed for other things? And so thinking about use and alternative uses is really important because often what happens is down the road, other uses are thought of and people are like, hey, we already have the data, why not use it? The last one to put up here is disclosure, which comes back to public records, especially with government systems as these systems are created. Now we have public records, and we have to think about what is the personal information that gets out. Going back to the toll example I gave earlier, if the records of where I've been at a certain date and time are made public, somebody can learn my travel habits. So that's another kind of thing to think through as we talk about these systems. Now I'll go ahead and leave it there. That's on. Thank you.